both enjoyable and inspirational Pesach, and may it be the precursor of Geula. There's an interesting thought that one of the Belzer Rebbe says that when we do the Korach ceremony, the Hillel sandwich, when you take the matzah and the maror and you eat it together, and you recite a pasuk, Gemara, that says this is what Hillel used to do when there was a Beis HaMikdash, that he would eat the Pesach, the matzah, and the maror in a single sandwich to fulfill the verse, Al matzos u'marorim yochlu, that the Pesach should be eaten with matzah and maror. Now, the Belzer Rebbe points out that the pasuk Al matzos u'marorim yochlu is actually not referring to the regular Pesach. It's a pasuk for Pesach Sheni. If you were tamei and you had to bring it a month later, you have that pasuk. There is another pasuk in Parshas Bo, which is very similar, Sliyesh u'matzos al marorim yochlu. So l'chorah, the Haggadah quotes the wrong verse. Why does it quote in support of the idea of the sandwich a pasuk in Pesach Sheni? It ought to quote the pasuk in the regular Pesach. So the Belzer Rebbe says, implicit in this is a messianic aspiration, that we are praying not only should we be able to bring the Korban Pesach next year, but even this year, let Mashiach come before next month, and then we will bring the Korban Pesach Sheni. So our hope is not simply L'Shana Haba'ah, it's actually Chodesh Haba'ah. We should be zocheh to bring the Pesach Sheni. Now, the topic I'm going to talk about today is based, of course, on the Eretz Yisrael calendar, because we're here in Eretz Yisrael. But as you know, there is a perennial problem when Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliot, when the last extra day in the Galut occurs on a Shabbos, Eretz Yisrael will always be one parsha ahead until there's a catch-up. So, for example, in Eretz Yisrael, we read Parshat Shemini this last Shabbos because it was no longer Pesach. In Chutz La'aretz, it was Acharon Shel Pesach, and they read the Yom Tov reading. So consequently, this Shabbos, we're going to be reading Tazria Mitzorah, double parsha. In Chutz La'aretz, they're going to be reading Parshat Shemini. So for people who are traveling back and forth, and I will be in that predicament myself, there is going to be a problem of how you catch up or how you make the parshiot in sync. Eventually, they do catch up at some point. In other words, we'll have a double here that they don't have there, and as a result, it'll be caught up. But for a few weeks, there's going to be some problems. So you should consult your LOR, local Orthodox rabbi, to determine what you do for those difficult situations. But since we are in Eretz Yisrael, I will be addressing Eretz Yisrael, and the topic I'm going to talk about is a topic that in many, many ways is very, very hyper-technical. And those who enjoy hyper-technical subjects enjoy this subject. But on the other hand, it's difficult at some level to find deep spiritual meaning, and I hope to at least show you some perspectives. And that is the laws of leprosy, the laws of the disease that are called sarat. And quite amazingly, if you add up the number of psukim that the Torah devotes to Shabbos, foundation of our faith, kashrut, and you compare them to the number of psukim that are devoted to the discussion of sarat, there are many more verses about sarat than there are about Shabbat and kashrut, which is quite astounding, because one would have assumed that the more important something is, the more space should be devoted to it, and yet here we find that sarat merited so much discussion. Now, in spite of the fact that there are so many verses, it's a very obscure area. So let's talk a little bit. I'm going to have to, with apologies, I'm going to have to be a little technical for a while, and then hopefully I'm going to move into a more general discussion. First, as I'm sure you know and learned over the years, the common translation of tsarat as a leprosy is not quite an accurate translation, or at least it does not correspond to the disease that is known or used to be known. It's actually not even known that way that much today anyway, as leprosy, which is Hansen's disease. Because first of all, Hansen's disease is a contagious disease, but it does not correspond clinically with what the Torah describes as sarat. Sarat in the Torah, the closest thing to sarat is psoriasis, and in fact, psoriasis might be connected to sarat. and it is a skin condition, which involves a discoloration of the skin into a particular shade of white. So any other discoloration does not amount to tsarat. And as the Rambam points out, and the Rambam, of course, was a doctor, tsarat is not intrinsically a medical condition, because the Torah requires that the person be brought to the Cohen. And if it would be a medical condition, we would go to a doctor. We would go to a rofei. We would not go to a Cohen. But rather, the Rambam explains, as Chazal teach, that tsarat is a physical manifestation of a spiritual illness that is within a person's character. And essentially, it's a wake-up call to engage in a certain introspection and tshuva process. And therefore, it's not at all contagious. And in fact, as we'll see, the reason for the apparent quarantine of the mitzvah is not because of fear of contagiousness, but for other reasons, which I will get to. So that's step number one. On one hand, well, actually, there are three types of tsarat. I'm only going to talk about one of them tonight. There is the tsarat of the flesh, there is the tsarat of garments, and there is the tsarat of houses. So you can have houses, you can have garments, you can have person. But we will talk about tsarats of the person. And by the way, the Rambam brings another interesting proof that it's not a physical disease, an illness, because it mentions there are certain times of year that even if a person has the symptomology of tsarat, the Cohen does not proclaim him to be a mitzorah. For example, during Yom Tov, including Chol HaMoed or Shabbat, we do not proclaim mitzorahs. A chatan or a kala that developed tsaras symptoms during the 7 days of celebration, we do not proclaim them to be a mitzorah. Now, if this was a contagious disease, that really makes no sense at all. If anything, on Yom Tov, when you're around a lot of people, the danger should be much greater. But if you understand that it's a message from God to engage in a tshuva or an introspective process, then we can understand that at certain times we will delay it because of other duties that may have a higher priority, such as the joy of the Yom Tov or the joy of a newly married couple. So the Rambam says the whole thing is an idea of a spiritual introspection. And in particular, Chazal tell us there are a number of averos for which reason tsarat can come to a person. The most prominent is lashon hara. The word mitzorah, motzi ra, he who brings out bad about other people, mitzorah. It can also come for gasut ruach, arrogance. In fact, Chazal actually say the tsaras of the flesh is because of lashon hara. The tsaras of garments is because of gasut ruach, arrogance, gasut ruach, arrogance, because clothing is often a vehicle to show off. And the tsarat of the bayit is tsarut ayin, selfishness in terms of sharing your money or your property, etc., tsarut ayin, right? So essentially you're dealing with averos that are character flaws, seeing the bad in others, being negative about others, being arrogant and being selfish and not willing to share with other people. Okay. Indeed, this explains, the Rambam writes, why the mitzorah sits in isolation for a while. Because lashon hara ultimately is something that destroys communities, destroys friendships, impairs relationships in a very, very negative way. Now, a person might say, I don't really care, I don't need people. I'm self-sufficient. I really don't care about the impact of my words on others. So the concept of isolating him has a twofold message. One is, he is a danger to the community, because that type of attitude, if it spreads, can destroy marriages, can destroy relationships. So we're putting him away, literally, because he is a dangerous person. But the other aspect of it is in reverse. Because a person whose attitude is, I am indifferent to human relationships. I don't need human relationships. We want the person to experience what it is like to be alone. And then the person understands the enormity of what he did and the sinfulness of what he did by experiencing a kind of loneliness and a kind of separation from the community of man. I remember when I was in middle school, many years ago, shortly after the Civil War. So there was a story written, "The Man Without a Country." Right? It's a famous story that I think all middle school kids read it. And the idea was that he was tried for something, and he had declared that he doesn't care about the United States, and he wishes he would never hear about it again. And essentially, his sentence was that he would be on a ship, and no one would ever be allowed to mention the United States in his presence, and any newspaper he read, any reference to the United States would be cut out. And being totally separated from his country made him realize how much he loved his country and how much he needed his country. And lahavdil, this is exactly the process of the Mitzorah, that the isolation and the quarantine are designed to make him understand how much a human being needs to be connected to others, and therefore the sins of arrogance and the sins of lashon hara that destroy those relationships are so destructive. In fact, a child psychologist will tell you, in the whole area of punishing children, disciplining children, they say that one should not focus on punishment, one should focus on consequence. In other words, they're not punishing, but a person should simply experience the consequences of their behavior. So, for example, if they don't get up on time or whatever it would be, then they're going to have to walk to school because Abba has to go to work. Something like that. This is exactly the same thing. We're not punishing the Mitzorah. We're making him experience the consequences of the types of attitudes that he has. And that is ultimately the best pedagogical device. That's how a person gets educated and trained morally, by seeing the negative consequences of the behaviors that they engage in. Okay, so that's a general perspective about Mitzorah. Now, there's yet another aspect about Mitzorah that's so interesting, and that is the pivotal role of the Cohen in the process. The umpires like to say, it's not a ball or a strike until I call it as a ball and a strike, meaning, not that umpires are great metaphysical philosophers, but essentially they're saying that a ball and a strike is not an existential reality. It is a reality that comes into existence only by virtue of the decision. Well, Saras is exactly that way. It's not like a medical diagnosis. When somebody, God forbid, if somebody has a disease, the doctor's diagnosis doesn't create the disease. It simply determines what is already there. With Saras, halachically, it is literally not leprosy until the Cohen, and it has to be a Cohen, until the Cohen proclaims it to be leprosy. And it's interesting that even if the Cohen doesn't know the halachot, and the Cohen has to consult with a great Talmid Chacham to determine this, the great Talmid Chacham is not the one that makes it leprosy. It's the Cohen's proclamation after consulting with the great Talmid Chacham. So the Talmid Chacham doesn't have a role here other than in advising the Cohen, but the Cohen does it. Now, what is the important role of the Cohen? So here there are two different ideas. Idea number one is, if Saras teaches us how vitally important good speech is, because speech can destroy, a person's attitude might be, I'm not going to talk, I'm not going to connect. Why should I open my mouth if there are so many destructive consequences? They tell the story, the Chafetz Chaim, as we know, wrote his famous Svarim on Lashon Hara, and there was a rabbi who couldn't believe that a human being could be so careful and so conscientious about speech. So he wanted to visit the Chafetz Chaim incognito, without identifying himself as a rabbi, so he would kind of see if the Chafetz Chaim was living up to his teachings. So he came to Radin, and he noticed that the Chafetz Chaim's son-in-law was so quiet, never said a word unless it was Torah and Tefillah. But the Chafetz Chaim was sitting and joking and telling stories. And he thought to himself, I don't know, why is the Chafetz Chaim so famous as the one who never says Lashon Hara? I see that the son-in-law is even much more meticulous. But then he realized, wait a second here. It's relatively easy to be meticulous if you simply don't talk. The Chafetz Chaim managed, as it were, to be fully engaged in conversations of all sorts and never crossed the line into negativity. And that is an important yesod, because speech is not simply this poisonous thing that you need to avoid. Very much the opposite. Speech can comfort, can build up, can give strength, can convey insight. It is one of the distinguishing qualities of the godly soul of a human being. When it says in the Chumash that God breathed into man the nefesh chaya, the live soul, the Targum Onkelos says, ruach mamala, the power of speech. So speech is a godly function. In fact, Kabbalistically, one of the reasons why Lashon Hara is so bad is you're taking the most godly function that you have, and it's like running a sewer through it. In fact, the Gemara tells us, the Talmud Yerushalmi tells us, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai once remarked, Hashem should have given us two different mouths. One is a mouth for holiness, and the other is a mouth for everyday speech. Because how can I contaminate my holy mouth with all of the bad speech that I engage in? But then he realized God was smarter. Because if even with one mouth we have so much Lashon Hara, even though I still have to daven and learn, if I had a dedicated Lashon Hara mouth, it would be a lot worse. By the way, this is an interesting Yerushalmi because Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, the great Rosh Hashiva, the great martyr of the Holocaust, and the very close Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim, was a very serious man. He says his Talmidim say he almost never smiled. He was very, very serious. But when he used to say this Yerushalmi, he would break out in a little bit of a smile. So the Talmidim noticed it because it was so rare. But this even made Rabbi Chanan crack a smile. But okay, so that's one aspect. So why do you go to the Cohen? Because the Cohen is the exemplar of speech that is used for good, constructive purposes. Right? Aaron is the prototype of the Cohen. Who is Aaron? Aaron is Ohev Shalom V'Rodev Shalom. So consequently, right, he made peace between people. So we tell the Mitzorah, look at the model of the Cohen, how to use your speech in good ways. Words comfort. Remember the verse in Proverbs, death and life are in the hands of the tongue. That doesn't just mean your lips can kill you. Let's say loose lips sink ships, an old Navy saying. And that's true as well. But it doesn't just mean you can physically die. But it means words can destroy a person emotionally. And they can also give life and comfort and strength. So our goal is not to shut up. Our goal is that our words should be vehicles that help others and give comfort to others and give strength to others. And that is why the Cohen is so deeply involved. The other aspect is that a person might say, oh, words don't matter. Why so bad? Right? The old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names do never hurt me. Names will never hurt me. Well, Saras is a halachic example of how words make a difference, because Sarat comes into existence not by the medical, biological phenomena, but by the koach hadibur of the Cohen. He calls it power of speech. Speech affects realities. And the statement, of course, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, is simply not true. If anything, the bones that are broken by sticks and stones can often heal. Not always, but they can often heal. The pain inflicted by speech might never heal. I remember listening to an interview with Richard Nixon many years ago. He already resigned the presidency of the U.S., but he was already being rehabilitated. Nixon was very masterful in eventually, by the time he died, he was held in high esteem by quite a number of people, and more or less he was accepted as, a good guy, and, in many ways he was a good guy. He was an enormously complex personality. But he was talking about 6th grade playground taunts and how it affected him. Now, here was a guy who went through the Watergate. He resigned the presidency of the United States. He was involved with China, the highest diplomacy in the world, nuclear powers. And things that happened to him in the 6th grade were still on his mind after all of that. And who knows what influence that had, maybe subconsciously, on all sorts of decisions that were made that affected the world. And this is true for people like Saddam Hussein. It is true for people like Adolf Hitler. Now again, obviously I'm not going to take the liberal line that all of these mass murdering dictators are products of childhood difficulties. There are, Baruch Hashem, people that have suffered a lot in childhood who still manage to become good and righteous people. But it cannot be denied that those experiences push people in a certain way, and they don't always make the choices to get beyond it. So words are powerful, and therefore tzarat is activated by word, not by the actual tzarat. And the Cohen is put in there to kind of teach us the positive power of speech as opposed to its negative and destructive force. Okay, so now let's go into a situation. A person wakes up in the morning and they find a white splotch on their hand. And this wouldn't apply today because you don't have a Beit HaMikdash, so you don't have to worry about it. Meaning, that's why no one's a Mitzorah today. Meaning, even if I have exactly the condition that corresponds to the Torah's Tzarat, if we don't have the Beit HaMikdash and the Cohen that can rule on that, I am not a Mitzorah. That's exactly why leprosy as a halachic idea does not exist today. But in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, I wake up and I find a white splotch on my hand. I think it might be tzarat, I'm not sure. I have a chiyuv d'oraisa to present myself to a Cohen. The Cohen examines it to see if it corresponds to the precise definitions. I'm not going to get into that, but there is a precise definition. If it does not, the Cohen just says, go home, nothing. If it does, I am put in quarantine for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, the Cohen comes back to examine me. Now, there might be 3 things that happen. Again, this is going to be a little technical. If the nega is simply the splotch that was certified as sarat. If the nega has expanded, I get upgraded or downgraded into a definitive mitzorah. We'll discuss what that means. If a black hair in the area turned white, I also get upgraded, meaning these are 2 simanei tuma, meaning to say you can be upgraded from provisional mitzorah to permanent mitzorah with either expansion of the nega or the conversion of the black hair, if there is, to a white hair. If, however, there is no hair or the hair didn't turn white and there's no expansion, the nega is simply still there, so then I'm quarantined for another week. And then, at the end of the 2nd week, the Cohen makes a 2nd examination. So here, once again, if it's expanded, I am definitive mitzorah. If the black hair turned white, if there is, I am definitive. But if nothing happened, even though the tzarat is still there, the tzarat is still there. But if it didn't expand and the black didn't turn white, I go home. I go home. Which means, even if a person has halachic leprosy, he is not a definitive mitzorah unless you have one of 2 simanim of tuma, which is pisayon. Pisayon is expansion of the nega, or seor banega hafach lavan, turned white. Actually, I'm sorry, and I missed something. There's a 3rd sign that can do it as well. The 3rd sign that can do it is called michya, that in the middle of the nega, there's a piece of healthy flesh that appears. Now, you would think that would be a good sign, but no. It's very much the opposite. That is a siman of tuma. Now, once you're upgraded into definitive Mitzorah status, you have to wait until the nega goes away, and then you have to count 7 days, and you have to bring many sacrifices. So it's a much, much longer and intensive process. Okay, so this is the technical structure that you need to know. Now, just to show you how complicated these halachot are, there's a whole different procedure, obviously, for clothing, and a whole different procedure for houses, and even skin tzaras has different issues, if it's on the hair or the beard, or it came as a result of a burn or a bruise. So each of them has a whole separate set of standards and halachot. I am just taking one out of 6 different types of leprosy, the most common, and that is sarat of the or basar, sarat of the skin. Okay, so you understand the idea. The idea is that after week number 1, if you have one of the simanei tuma, he's upgraded. If nothing happened, you wait till week number 2. If he has one of the simanei tuma, he is upgraded. If nothing happened, he is tahor. He doesn't have to worry about anything, even though the tzarat is still there. And the 3 simanim of tuma are a pisayon. The nega is bigger than it was. The second siman tuma is the black hair, if there's a black hair located in the area, like it's on the arm, turned white. And the third siman tuma is that within the nega, that's within the area that's covered by the white splotch, there is the appearance of healthy flesh. That's a bad thing, not a good thing, right? That's a siman tuma. So this is like hyper-technical, as I say, and there are many, 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 many details. But is there some spiritual message that we can get for this, and some practical lesson? Because obviously we don't have the halachos of tzarat today. So if we're learning them, it's because we try to derive some lessons that do apply to our avodas Hashem. What lessons might they be? So, as I said before, the purpose of the Mitzorah going into quarantine is to enable him to engage in introspection, to feel the consequences of his negative actions, to realize the enormity of his sin. The siman tuma is a physical manifestation from God, effectively telling the person that your introspective process is defective in various ways. Go back into the cave. Now, let's look at the 3 simanei tuma, because when a person is confronted with various imperfections of character, a person is confronted with evidence that he's hurt people, that he's done things that are inappropriate, that he perpetrated any form of emotional abuse, not just physical abuse, but emotional abuse. So those are hard, that's a hard medicine to take. None of us likes to be confronted with our inadequacies, our failings, and our faults. So as a result, we have many types of defense mechanisms which kind of prevents us from really confronting and dealing with the problem. And it is suggested by some Meforshim that the 3 simanim of impurity that upgrade a person into a definitive Mitzorah status represent the 3 types of excuses that we engage in order to avoid serious introspection and cheshbon and nefesh. The first, I'll take them in a different order. The first is the black hair turns white. Let's say the nega is located on an arm or a place that has black hair. So the first thing we might do is we might deny that we've done anything wrong. That's called, even in English, whitewashing. I am white. I am blameless. We might do it by simply not acknowledging what we did, or we might tell ourselves, they deserved it. Or you might say, they did a lot worse to me. Whatever form it takes, whether it takes the form of outright denial, or whether it's blaming the victim, which is a very common. Indeed, spousal abusers, this is a common refrain among spousal abusers. She, usually she's the victim, she made me do it. Now, I'm not justifying unreasonable behavior. There are people that behave in an unreasonable way, but that doesn't justify, hitting them or slapping them in the face. Now, that's another issue. So, if the Cohen examines the Mitzorah, right? The original Soraz tells the Mitzorah, you got an Aveira for which you have to introspect. Good. Go into quarantine for 7 days. If the Cohen after 7 days examines him, and the black hair turned white, that is a sign from God. You, sir, are still in denial. You are whitewashing. You have not admitted to yourself that you have something to work on. You need to go back. Now, by contrast, if at the end of the 2 weeks there is no Siman Tumah, that actually means you've completed the process. You can go home. Even though you have the nega, but you can work on tshuva at home because you've done enough introspection. Okay. So defense mechanism number 1 is whitewashing, which we will call denial. As I say, either outright denial, blaming the victim, giving rationalizations for what you did. Now, the second might be another almost opposite response. And that is a sense of such an overwhelming sense of guilt that I am enveloped with hopelessness that things could ever be rectified. So what's the point of even trying? This is actually exactly the opposite of the denial, but it has the same practical effect. There is not going to be any positive change because a person feels they are so far gone that there is no point in trying to be a better person. That is represented by the second Siman Tumah, where the nega just grows bigger. That even after you're aware of the sin, you let it grow bigger because you have a hopelessness that things could ever be better. In fact, there is a connection between denial and hopelessness in the sense that sometimes we move into a denial mode because it would be so painful to confront the reality of the situation that we would be overwhelmed with hopelessness, so we put it into denial. Right? So the Seyar Lavan is denial, and the Pisayon, that's the expansion of the nega, is hopelessness and yiyush. But then there's a third response. And the third response is not exactly the same as denial, although it seems a bit similar. The third response is emotional distancing. I just don't allow myself to think about it, perhaps because that will lead me to hopelessness and paralysis. That in order for me to function, I cannot let myself dwell on the negativities within my personality. That is represented by the healthy flesh in the middle of the nega, meaning even if I'm surrounded by all sorts of rot that I'm supposed to correct, I'm gonna not let it penetrate my heart, so to speak. So that's kind of emotional denial. No, I'm saying it's not there, it's emotional distancing. So it's not denial. See, denial is a cognitive process in which I make up a story. I make up a narrative. Emotional distancing is very different. I don't make up a narrative. I have no narrative. I just ignore the situation. I sweep it under the rug. And of course, if you keep on sweeping things under the rug, eventually the rug gets quite high, and it gets harder and harder to clean. So, what is the concept of the Simonei Tumah? The appearance of the tzarat tells the person, you have an aveira, you have a character flaw, do tshuva. Isolate yourself for 7 days. If a person has the siman of tumah, that indicates that he's either in a state of denial, or a state of hopelessness, or a state of emotional distancing. The remedy for that is continue the process till everything goes away, till your tshuva is complete and bring sacrifices and the like. If, however, after 2 weeks there is no siman tumah, then even if he still has the nega, he can go home. Because if these rationalizations don't exist, he has created the foundation for a healthy tshuva, and he can do that from the comfort of his home without going through all of the restrictions of the
Can
Matzah.
the white hair turn back to non-white hair?
Yeah.
Can the white hair?
Yes. If it turns back, he will also go home. Yeah,
Turns back.
That's correct. The simon itself could be reversed, meaning the nega could shrink, etc.
When the Rabbi says goes home, the person goes home, there's no offering.
Actually, there is a much more modest offering. There is an offering of 2 birds, but it's not really in the Beis HaMikdash. It's even offered outside of the Beis HaMikdash. 1 bird is slaughtered, and 1 bird is released. So that is the offering for the person who goes home because he never graduated into the full-fledged Mitzorah. But once you graduate to the full-fledged Mitzorah, then you have to wait till the leprosy goes away. Then you count 7 days after that, and then you bring animal offerings in the Beis HaMikdash.
There's 2 birds after the second week, or also after the first week?
No, it would only be after the second week, meaning the way it works is, if after the second week, if after the first week there are no simanei tumah, he doesn't go home, we just quarantine him for another week. If after the second week he has any of the simanei tumah, he is upgraded to a full mitzorah. If he does not, he goes free, but he has to bring the 2 birds. Okay? Again, the technical, yeah.
I'm going to ask you, is the Mitzorah one of the things that we think is going to come back in time of the Beis HaMikdash, if we give so much time to it?
Well, it's an interesting question. I guess that it's part of a larger question. Are there going to be sins in the time of Mashiach? Meaning, obviously, the surface of the Beit HaMikdash is going to come back when Mashiach comes. But Mitzorah depends on people doing certain Averos. So this would depend. If the Messianic era is an era in which there will be no sin, then there will be no Mitzorah. If, on the other hand, it's an era where people will still sin, albeit they'll be much more righteous, then it would come back. So, and by the way, I want to point out, the Ramban makes an interesting point, that Sarat is actually a gift of the Almighty. It's a form of prophecy to give a person a direct message. Although, again, it's certainly not comfortable to be a Mitzorah, and it's also humiliating, because people know my public shame, but it is a gift from God because it gives a person feedback. Now, I remember when I taught law school for many years at the University of Maryland. So in law school, it's common that only 1 exam is given at the end of the semester. There's 1 final. In other words, there's the average course does not have papers, written work in the middle, there's no midterm. So a person's whole grade depends on 1 exam at the end of a course. So law school students are anxious anyway, for a whole bunch of reasons. So a common anxiety that students expressed was, if they could only have some feedback during the semester, how they were doing, that could help them adjust their studies and the like. And yet, the common law school experience, again, the seminars are different. Seminars did have written work, but if you're talking about the large class lecture, there was no feedback whatsoever. So with Hashem, lahavdil, we have the same issue. If only God would tell me what I need to do. When there was Saras, God was telling you what you needed to do. So as bad as it is, the Ramban writes, it was a great, great gift from God. And that is why, when Saras left us? Saras left us when prophecy left us. Because Saras is an aspect of divine prophecy given to individuals to be a precise, targeted message, what they need to work on in their spiritual lives.
So it didn't exist in Beit HaMikdash Hasheni?
So it seems to be from that in the Bayit Sheni, there were no, the ritual of Mitzorah did not exist.
We need it back.
That's what it seems.
We need
Only from the time of Yitzchak Mitzrayim.
Say again?
Only from the time of the Mishkan to...
Yes, from the time of the Mishkan till the very beginning of the Bayit Sheni. Now,
about 800 and 900 years or something.
from Yitzias Mitzrayim to the end of the Bayit Rishon is 850 years. That period of time. Now, I don't have a sense of how many numbers. We don't have any statistics. How often was this? There is one comment in the Gemara that, according to one opinion, sarat of the houses never occurred. It was a totally theoretical halacha, just like the rebellious son. Lo haya, v'lo nivra. But the Gemara does not say that about the leprosy of people, so there were such situations. And in fact, Tanakh itself gives us examples. Besides Miriam, which is in the Chumash itself, Moshe, remember Moshe's hand turned leprous, Miriam was a mitzorat. But we read about, in the Haftorah of Tazria, we read about 4 Anoshim Mitzoraim, who were Jewish. We read about a non-Jew getting tzorat, which is actually very unusual. Naaman, and that's halachically very, very unusual. Because Sarat is normally, God's gift, so to speak, to the Jewish people. So Sarat was certainly not unknown among people, but among and of course one of the kings, one of the Malchei Yisrael, got Sarat. Uziyahu. This is not recorded specifically, but it mentions that Uziyahu was one of the Malchei Yehuda, and it mentions that this is the only example of a king retiring, and like Pope Benedict, and passing the melucha to his son, but there's no discussion of why he retired. But Chazal give you a whole backstory that Uziyahu wanted to take the role of the Cohen as well as Melech, so he went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to bring incense, and he was immediately smitten with sarat on his forehead. That's interesting. This wasn't Lashon Hara, so to speak, but this is what he got. Arrogance. Sarat on his forehead. And as a result, halachically, there's a whole question. A Mitzorah cannot assume royal authority. And as a result, Uziyahu was no longer able to be Melech. So he's the only instance, really, of a functioning king forced, as it were, to abdicate because of Sarat. So clearly there was saras of people, but we're not really sure about we don't have any record of the numbers. So what's interesting is this. What's interesting is we just had Chag HaPesach. And the key message of Chag HaPesach, the key mitzvah of Chag HaPesach is, of course, biur chametz, getting rid of chametz, right? Not only are you not allowed to eat chametz, you're not allowed to own chametz, you're not allowed to possess chametz. And this is a very serious thing. Because if you didn't dispose of your chametz, either by eating it, by destroying it, or by selling it to a goy, which many of us do, the chametz that you had in your possession over Pesach becomes permanently prohibited even after Pesach. Right? You know this. This is why when Jewishly owned stores did not sell their chametz during Pesach, you're not allowed to buy chametz from those stores until they had a turnover of stuff that they got after Pesach. That's why you may remember Chutz La'aretz, the OU would say, don't buy from this store till Lag BaOmer or whatever it was, because you might be buying chametz that they owned. In fact, there's an interesting machlokus now in the United States, just to digress for a moment. One of the major beer distributors, it's a Jewish distributorship, and some kashrus organizations announced that you cannot buy any of their beer, and they provide 50 or so different brands of beer to many, many supermarkets in the New York, New Jersey area. Now, the funny story about it is, this distributor did sell his chametz to a rabbi. He sold the beer of course is chametz, he sold the beer to the rabbi who sold it to a goy. But the distributor then continued to market the beer during Pesach. So the halachic question is this. If I sell my chametz to a guy, so it's technically not mine, but I simply continue to operate my store and pocket the money, does that invalidate the sale? Does that show, in other words, that I thought it was just a joke? So there's really a big machlokas. Rav Moshe Feinstein, in fact, this is a big problem with a lot of stores. I mean, a lot of times a store will sell its chametz just to make the rabbi or the Jewish people happy, and then totally ignore what it means to sell your chametz. Their business will be open on Pesach. They will sell the chametz, and they're not going to give the goy the money for that sale. They're going to keep the money. So some poskim say any person who says that he sells his chametz and then behaves exactly the way he behaved before he sold his chametz, didn't really intend to sell his chametz at all. And if he didn't intend to sell his chametz at all, that chametz cannot be bought by a Jew even after Pesach. And you got to wait until there's a turnover. And that is what those poskim say about this beer distributor, that you can't buy this beer. Rav Moshe Feinstein, on the other hand, did have a lenient view. Rav Moshe said, hey, a deal is a deal is a deal. The chametz was sold. It is true that if the business continues to sell the chametz after it sold it to a guy, the person is stealing from the guy. Okay, that's an aveira. But the fact that he's stealing from the guy doesn't mean there hasn't been a sale to the guy. And therefore, Moshe Feinstein ruled that when the chametz is purchased back after Pesach from the guy, you as a Jew are allowed to. So essentially, these beer announcements that you get in New York, some kashrus organizations say there is a problem, and some kashrus organizations say there is no problem. So it's a little bit of a turf war between kashrus organizations. But the point I wanted to connect you with to Tzaras is the following. So we talk about getting rid of chametz. And chametz, we know, symbolizes the Yetzer Hara of a person. It's puffed up, it is arrogant. The Yetzer Hara is called Sa'or Shebe'isa, the leavening agent of the dough. But what's interesting is, if you look in the Meforshim, for the three, that there are different reasons why chametz represents negativity, it's interesting that there are three aspects of chametz that actually corresponds to the three simanei tumah of Mitzvah. Aspect number one is chametz is puffed up and full of air. That represents arrogance and gaiva. Arrogance and gaiva corresponds to whitewashing and denial. Because if I'm not willing to admit that I have flaws and failures, that represents a certain arrogance on my part, that I'm above it. So the puffy nature of the chametz, arrogance, corresponds to the white hair, which is whitewashing. That's one aspect of chametz. Now, a second aspect of chametz, the Maharal writes, is one difference in chametz and matzah is chametz spoils and rots and gets moldy. And matzah does not spoil that much. Right? You can still get matzah from Masada, they say. Sometimes feel that we do have those matzahs. Matzah could be very old and still edible in a way that chametz is not. Chametz represents the progression of rot. That corresponds to the hopelessness of pisayon, that when a person is in a bad way, they continue to go in the bad way because they have a hopelessness and a helplessness that they are able to change, that they feel that they're not able to change. Now, a third symbol of chametz, the Maharal writes, is chametz represents inertia, and matzah represents action. Why is that so? Because when flour hits water, if you do nothing at all, it will become chametz automatically. You don't need a starter, you don't need yeast, you don't need a leavening agent. Doing nothing will create chametz. Matzah requires taking action. Doing nothing, generally, inertia, suggests emotional distance. I simply do not relate to the situation in any way, and that corresponds to the michya, to the healthy flesh in the nega. So the concept is that it's not accidental that right after Pesach, which focuses on the eradication and destruction of chametz, we read about Sarat, which also has three simanim of Tumah that corresponds to three negativities of chametz. The Sar Lavan, which is denial, corresponds to the arrogance of chametz, the puffed up. The Pisayon, the expansion of the Makkah, which corresponds to hopelessness, corresponds to the progressive rot of chametz. And finally, the michya, the healthy flesh within, which corresponds to emotional distancing, corresponds to the message of chametz as inertia. And these are three negative factors we have to overcome in our own spiritual lives. Acknowledge what we need to change. Do not be overwhelmed with hopelessness. Be optimistic that we have the power to effect positive change. And confront, meaning don't emotionally sweep it under the rug, but be willing to engage and be open to it. So B'ezrat Hashem, as we go through the Omer, which is supposed to be a zman of spiritual introspection, may these lessons guide us and inspire us and help us to prepare for Kabbalat HaTorah. So,